Hello and welcome to Lightcast webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing from Andy Derman, who is Global VP, and also Duncan Brown, who is with Lightcast and our innovation man, if you want for a better expression. Yes, so we have a great discussion on a new way of looking at skills today, and if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the control box and we will get back to them at the end of the presentation if we have time. We will be doing a follow-up which will contain the recording and the slides from the webinar, so please keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today as we dive once again into the wonderful world of skills in the labour market. So very excited to have Duncan, the real brains of this operation, joining me today. So thank you, Duncan, and we'll bring you in shortly. But before we get into the clever stuff, just wanted to offer my welcome to long-term Lightcast viewers and also to any newbies who are joining us today. So welcome. And for those that aren't so familiar, just a quick introduction to who we are and what we're doing and why we do it. So we are Lightcast. We have brought together over the last few years the best of the EMSI and burning glass infrastructure to create a whole new entity on a really important mission right now, which is to unlock new possibilities in the labour market. The world of work is a very complex, interconnected, fast-moving place, and of course is so foundational to economic prosperity, cultural prosperity, and societal prosperity. Easy for me to say. So you know, as we focus our efforts and our skills and our talents, we really want to help you as organizations working in and around the labor market to unlock new possibilities for your organizations and the communities that you support through the use of labor market information. So we're grateful for the work that you do with the data that and tools that we provide. And in terms of how we help you, it's all about labor market data. We want to illuminate what is actually happening in the labor market. If we can understand the labor market, how it's moving, changing, interconnected, then of course we can start to make better, more informed decisions to really unlock those emerging, exciting opportunities and possibilities. So we do this through pulling together a range of information that is derived from official government statistics in our structural labour market information, through to big data sources such as online job posting activity and professional profiles, to really illuminate what the key core components of labour markets, right down to a local level, look like. And we deliver this data through a range of services, ranging from our software platforms to allow you to dive into the data and interrogate the data, through to data provision itself. So our data is served up via API and Snowflake, so you can access the wealth of information that we've got for your own purposes. And we also have a strong applied research capability through Duncan and his team, our team of economists and data analysts who can answer specific questions and build bespoke solutions to meet your specific needs. So that's a little bit about us. As I refer back to the mission that we're on, and we're talking about unlocking new possibilities in the labour market, one of the things that we've really focused in on as a business, and I'm sure you will have noticed, is that in order to really truly unlock the possibilities in the labour market, we really need to get down to understanding the labour market at its most granular building block level. And so we've invested a lot of time and effort and focus on really trying to illuminate the skills layer of the labour market. I think we all know that it's really at that skills and competencies and capabilities level that the connections are made between the supply of talent, i.e. the skills that individuals have or are learning or evolving, and the demand for talent, i.e. employers who are seeking skills and capabilities to help solve business problems and serve business needs. And so we have spent a lot of time really delving into our data to try and illuminate that level of data and help you as organizations put those pieces back together in a more comprehensive way to help you serve your audiences with the solutions that you are bringing to bear. So Duncan, we're going to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing and give you guys a bit of a sneak preview of some work we've been doing on our skills data to help us kind of look beyond the surface. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about what we mean when we talk about skills data.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so as you've alluded to, we have a big investment in our skills taxonomy. So Lightcast Skills has, I think, about 33,000 skill items. So we say skills, but it really covers knowledge, skills, and abilities all together. And these are things that employers and employees talk about in their job ads and their CVs that help them describe what competencies they've got. And so we maintain this enrichment process, which basically looks through a document and says, well, which of these skill items are actually on there? And so as you've been talking about our data sources, we have a database with hundreds of millions of job postings in different countries around the world. And as job postings come through, we scan through them and we identify what skills are on them. And then that allows us to look in conjunction with other taxonomies at what skills are concentrated in particular kinds of jobs, in particular kinds of places and industries and so on. And so most of the work that we'll be looking at here is on our job posting side, but we do it on our profiles data as well, which looks at the sort of the profile of individual workers. So for example, we can compare the supply of talent with the demand for it as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And so the Lightcast Skills Library, I think we have up over 30,000 unique skill terms within that library. So pretty darn comprehensive. And probably most interestingly, I think, and probably the biggest difference here in terms of the approach that we're taking is that it's a live library, isn't it? So we're updating the skill terms on a 2-weekly, fortnightly cadence as we see new terms emerging in the labor market, but also as our community of users of the library make recommendations in terms of skills that they would like to see in there, and we can test and assess those, can't we? As we look for them in the labor market. So talking of that then, a good deal, we've spoken quite a lot on this webinar series, haven't we, about skills, whether that's looking skills more generally or within specific contexts. So you'll recall a couple of months ago we looked at AI-based skills. We've talked about green skills in the past, and a lot of what we've looked at has been really surfacing the quantitative side of skills, the presence of skills, the volume, the trend over time, and that really gives us a good start, doesn't it? A good view at the skills layer. But I think very quickly what we've come to notice, and certainly feedback with our work with customers, has been once we get that layer of understanding, we really want to get to the next level of contextual understanding, and particularly the qualitative understanding. So you're going to tell us a little bit now about the why behind that and what do I mean by that, and then also share with us some work that you and your team have been doing to use economic techniques to really start to actually build a bit more structure to that thinking, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sort of the underlying point here is that a lot of the use of the skills data that we've put so far is we look at the sort of the frequency of skills and how often they're mentioned in different kinds of occupations and places and so on. And that's useful. I mean, there's no doubt about it, but it does run into some limits. You know, there are some skills, for example, that are just everywhere. So if you think about things like communication and leadership, it's kind of everywhere in demand. It's actually hard to find it, you know, in a good place, but you know, it is kind of, you know, it doesn't mean that employers don't ask for it all the time. And so when you just kind of focus on the frequencies, you kind of get the sort of the more predictable ones coming to the top. And so we want to kind of get under the skin of those kind of points, and we want to understand how the sort of the mix of skills changes and what that means, and whether it becomes more and less diverse, whether certain skills spread throughout the labour market or become more specialised, whether you know, this is a real thing for us in the long term, where you've got some skills that are quite widespread. So you think of Microsoft Excel, for example. You know, if you see a job for an administrator saying Microsoft Excel, they might only be using it to kind of keep lists. and organise a sort of an event and things like that. And it's important, but it doesn't require a lot of Excel skill. Whereas on another job ad, maybe for a quantitative financial analyst, it says Excel, and the expectation is that you're going to use all of the advanced functionality there, the sort of formulas, the pivot tables, the macros, even all of those kinds of things. And employers will often just say Microsoft Excel, and they just assume the context away. And the more that we can find ways of actually getting under the skin of that and understanding what the implied meaning of it is, the more powerful our data becomes, really. And so, and all of this has a real kind of potential benefit across all of the kinds of people that use Lightcast data. So, if you're a workforce planner, you want to know not only what kinds of skills that the key roles that you're recruiting for in the future are going to need, but what are the really important ones, and what are the skills that will really make the difference to that job. Another one is, if you're an education provider, again, we can give you a long list of skills, but understanding which ones are rising in importance, which ones have kind of that universal character that will actually help people get lots of different kinds of jobs, are all important. And the same there applies if you're developing the sort of the local economy, understanding which of the skills that your local workforce has got that are really attractive to certain kinds of employer are all very useful.
Yeah, cool, thanks. And so you've got a few different approaches that your team have been modeling with the data, and a few examples to share us, haven't you? So take us through.
Yeah, exactly. So it's early days on this, and so we've been doing some R&D work, and sort of we've got a few research projects in the offing now where we'll start to use them in anger, in a constructive anger, I should say.
It's data anger.
Yeah, exactly, data anger. It's very cerebral. And so what we've looked at doing is constructing some metrics that allow us to sort of answer some of those questions, really, and sort of move from the kind of the sort of the broad kind of lens of frequency to the much more specific one where we can actually give real insights about occupations and skills. And we've drawn on a range of different areas, different kinds of statistical techniques. Some of it comes from a whole area called economic complexity, which has been used to understand how a web of knowledge changes an economy. And so we've applied that same conceptual framework to skills in the labour market, and sort of draw together a few metrics. The first ones look at just the sort of the distribution of skills within occupations and then across occupations. And then we look at some others which look at how skills concentrate and trying to predict where they should concentrate. And then we'll look at some other work that's in an earlier stage, but just talk about the intuition on that. So if you go to the next one. So the first one is diversity, and what we're talking about here is skill diversity. Over time, occupations can acquire a range of different skills in them. Some, if you think about low skill jobs, they tend not to be that varied in skill mix. If you think about a farmhand, it's kind of, there are a very specific set of skills that they have to do, and they have to do them well or not at all. Whereas when you go to higher skilled jobs, and often middle skilled jobs as well, they can have quite a mix of skills, and understanding sort of the range of skills is quite important to understanding sort of how complex a territory it is. So on the left hand side here, we just compare a sort of a bunch of selected occupations to sort of see that range. And so we've got a summary metric which just measures how what sort of the breadth of range of skills within each occupation's demand and how it varies by occupation. So at the low end, we've got bus and coach drivers who have skills around managing the equipment, driving a bus, and working with their passengers, and it's pretty much solidly around those. And then at the opposite extreme, you have programmers and software development professionals, where you've got many different branches off in terms of what kinds of things that they're working on. They can be back-end developers and front-end developers and work with different kinds of technology. They can be data scientists rather than programmers, and all these kinds of things. And so that means that the skills territory in programmers and software development professionals becomes very unpredictable, very diverse, very varied, and going in different directions. And so, and you can see that marketing associate professionals is the next one there. And we know that there are different branches there in terms of advertising, digital, and all those kinds of things as well, market strategy, market research, and so on. On the right hand side, we just take 4 occupations and we plot how their diversity of skills has changed over time. And one of the interesting things here is that you see how 2 jobs there, programmers and software development professionals, and web design and development professionals fell in terms of skill diversity from 2017 to 2019. So that's before the pandemic, which is an important point. The height of recruitment demand for those roles was actually around 2015, 2016. We had a lot of recruitment demand then. And what it seems to be the case is that when employers are really pushing the bounds of demand is when they start to demand more specialised roles. And that's an interesting pattern that's emerging from this work. When employers start to rein back demand, they start to say, well, actually, we just want somebody who can do a bit of everything. Yeah. And so you see that, especially with the pandemic, with HR and industrial relations officers, and to a lesser extent with marketing associate professionals there, where especially with HR and industrial relations officers as an occupation, it's kind of chugging along, fairly unchanged, and then the pandemic hits and it falls off. But then with all these occupations, you see that when the pandemic begins to sort of draw back and the labour market resets somewhat in 2021, diversity starts going up quite quickly. And so you see actually employers start getting a lot more aggressive about, I want these particular kinds of skills and I want these particular kinds of skills. And so it gives us a sort of an underlying sense of how the sort of the content of demand is changing.
That's really interesting, and just for clarity, I think we're looking here, aren't we, at the UK as an example.
Yeah, I should have said that.
Applicable anywhere in anywhere we have this data. It just struck me as I was looking at your chart on the left-hand side: programmers and software development professionals, marketing associate professionals. As you say, they're pretty broad categories. They're SOC code categories, aren't they? Whereas bus and coach drivers are a little bit more specific. So this can also maybe start to give us clues as to the sensible levels at which to be defining the reality of the labour market, right? So we know, as you said, we know that within currently the SOC code for programmers and software development professionals, it does encompass a whole wide range of roles that back when the definition was set wouldn't have been the case, and that's evolved over time. So it might also give us a few clues as to kind of the sensible level at which the labour market actually works. We go out and talk about bus and coach drivers in a way that we don't talk about generic programmers. We talk about specific breeds within there. So it just helps us maybe think a little bit about the levels and layers within the labour market in that respect.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's it's a good point. And I think the sort of the more diverse the skills mix becomes, then the more that suggests that actually we're aggregating at too high a level, really. So but if
the fun side note on that one is, of course, we recognize that and some of the limiting factors of some of these classifications, don't we? So we've got some really exciting secondary work on our occupation taxonomy that's evolving, that's recently been launched in the US, and will come to other data sets very soon, where we build a bit more of a custom built and evolving occupation taxonomy that can help us manage some of these limitations.
Yeah, one that's more tailored to the data, and so compared to, say, the UK taxonomy that we use here has about 4 times the granularity. So that will make quite a big difference. So
webinar coming soon.
Absolutely. Should we go on to the next one? So ubiquity is looking at the same telescope that we were using a moment ago, but from the other direction. So whereas that was looking through occupations to look at the range of skills within them, here we're looking through skills to look at how they distribute across occupations. And the concept is that if a skill was required in equal proportion by every single occupation, then that would be the most ubiquitous it's possible to be. Whereas at the opposite extreme, if it's only present in one occupation and is just completely absent everywhere else, I almost said unpresent there, which would be just a bad choice of words. If it's absent everywhere else, then you'd have the lowest possible level of ubiquity. And so you can see with our sort of aggregate measure here, again on the left, you can see a range of skills that we've selected, where communications is the most ubiquitous of them, and Microsoft Excel is way up there, and agile methodology is quite high. That's quite an interesting one, because if you went back 5 or 10 years ago, it was not nearly so common. whereas it's actually spread from more of a sort of a digital and IT background to get into other areas of project management. Python in the middle, which as a programming language is quite an achievement, but Python does get a bit wider traction. And then at the opposite extreme, you've got photonics and component engineering. And I'd like to say I know what they are, but I don't really know what they are. They are very not ubiquitous. They are very much about very specific roles in very specific places that do those. And so you can see how that starts to tell us an interesting story then. There are certain skills that you can just expect to see everywhere. And it occurs with our common sense. We know that communications is just generally valuable, whereas, you know, in our workplace, we've never needed anybody with photonic skills, valuable as though they are.
Not yet.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's indeed. On the right-hand side, again, I've done it on a time series basis, but here what I've done is I've picked out 4 that have a kind of a statistics and data science kind of aspect to them, because it tells quite an interesting story, I think, where SAS, which is one of the kind of the longest established and very high-end statistical software, you know, very specialized, has become less ubiquitous since 2017. Not massively so, didn't start from a high level either, but it has become less ubiquitous. And what that means is it's become more specialized. You know, you're a pretty hardcore statistician or data science if you're using SAS these days. And part of the reason why it's become even more specialized is because the range of tools available to do stats and data science work has really exploded in the past 5 years. And we see all these stories about data being the new oil and data science and all of that, and it's all very sexy. It's not really, but that's what the sort of the press want to make it out to be. And so you can see there some of those tools are really exploding in terms of ubiquity as well. So if you look, that orange line there is Power BI, Microsoft's tool, which from 2017 to 2021 has tripled in terms of its level of ubiquity. It's become a lot more widespread across a lot of occupations. What Power BI does, and Tableau as well, I think Tableau started from a higher base, that's why it's not seen as much of a change, have done is kind of really democratize the ability to actually use data in a much more detailed way. But you can also see Pandas, which is a Python package. So if you know the Python programming language and you want to use it for data science, you can use the Pandas library. Andy knows all about it. And you can see that's become a lot more ubiquitous as well, which is quite an achievement for a programming language package to do so, because if you're going to use that way of doing things, then that's penetrated a lot of areas of life. And so speaking from an economics background, if I went sort of 5 or 10 years ago, it wasn't really the expectation that you could ever use a programming language as such. You used a few particular software packages if you were doing analysis. More and more, that boundary is kind of falling. It's still not the kind of the sort of entirely the norm, but it is becoming much more kind of usual to encounter people in an economics background who have a bit of programming nous with them. And I'm sure that's the case in other kind of analytic roles as well, where once you'd have either been a user of a high-end tool or not, now there are a range of tools that you can use, and so these start to become a lot more accessible, and ubiquity starts to increase.
Yeah, and the fact that you know these skills just goes to reinforce that you really are the brains behind this operation.
Yes, but
I thought the interesting thing, particularly when you look at these things over time, before you insult me, is actually looking at how skills, you know, emerge and grow, and then potentially might disappear as well, as you were describing. So I know we sort of got a hints of that, but I think as the time series grows, fascinating to see skills that sort of are cool and hip for a time and then disappear as quickly as they arrive, versus those skills that start as a relatively small thing in a very niche area that explodes out, like the Power BI example that you described. So again, very interesting to kind of track that time series analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is quite interesting, because we know that some technologies just die, and but often they just linger on in a few very niche places, and so you can imagine that there are some out there. So the next metric is reveal comparative advantage, and this is a measure of concentration. If you're used to Lightcast, data, then you'll know about the location quotient, which is a simple concentration metric which says the share of jobs in one region divided by the share of jobs nationally for that particular occupation or industry gives you a ratio where 1 means that the share locally is the same as nationally, and above 1 means it's relatively more concentrated, and that suggests that there's some comparative advantage there. And this is the same principle. So here what we do is we add all of the skill observations up in a particular occupation in this analysis that's presented here. And we express each skill as a share of the total number of skills there, and then we divide that by the same analysis across all occupations. And what we've done further is that we've used our skill categories. So Lightcast skills taxonomy is grouped into subcategories and categories that allow us a sort of a degree of hierarchy to understand it. It's particularly useful for this kind of analysis because, as you can see here, we've been able to plot the sort of express the surface of skills in each of these 4 occupations, very different occupations, to just help to sort of understand the mix of skills that employers demand. And we've used the revealed comparative advantage to say, well, which ones are actually notably large rather than just large for their own sake. So if you look at the top left, we've got electricians and electrical fitters, and there's a number of quite big boxes there. So business and physical inherent abilities, but they're grey because they've got a real comparative advantage of under 1, which means that basically they're not particularly concentrated. Lots of the skills in those boxes are just very frequently found, whereas it's maintenance, repair and facility services, and then slightly less so engineering, which are both large and concentrated there. And two really good cases at the bottom there with nurses and then with programmers, where you've got a big category in each case. Healthcare for nurses, almost about half of the skills mentioned there, and information technology, where 3/4 of the skills mentioned, which are very, very concentrated for them. And in fact, with programmers and software development professionals, there's only one other category, design, where they have a relative comparative advantage. All the other skills are doubtless valuable, but they're not any more valuable in for programmers at the category level than they are for the average job in the economy. And then HR managers at the top there has a much wider range of skills. It's much more balanced in that sense. And so if we go on a bit, I've got a worked example where we go through the categories and subcategories to look at specific skills. So as we said, this is programmers again, and information technology makes up 75% of the skills mentioned there. And if I break down just that box, it then goes into a range of subcategories there. And you'll see the largest one is software development. You've got Java, scripting languages. The text breaks down past a certain point, but the particularly darkest one is Microsoft development tools, which are very concentrated. I think that they've got a revealed comparative advantage of about 8, which means they're 8 times more likely to be found there than anywhere else. And then we can take one of those boxes, databases is the one that I chose, and break that down into the individual skills. And you can see there particular database technologies that are really big and important across the surface of programmer job ads. So you've got MongoDB, MySQL, Redis, Apache Kafka that are quite widely cited and also heavily concentrated as well.
Wow, that's detailed. What's the dark box?
I can't remember. I will have to tell you afterwards because
all but perfectly formed and highly niche to that database work within IT. Yes.
Yeah, like me. Relatedness is our 4th metric, and I haven't got a snappy chart to show on this one, but it's the principle that's important, because I'm going to put relatedness and reveal comparative advantage together on the next one. Relatedness looks at the web of skills across the economy and sort of sees how they interconnect and correlate together. And so what we find is, and the programmer case is a good example there, is that obviously certain skills tend to complement each other. If you're taking one database skill, you're probably taking another database skill, but you're probably also taking other skills that go around databases, about how you use them, what other kinds of technology that you're connecting them to, and so on. And so there's a whole kind of graph of knowledge that underlies the labour market there, where a HR manager knows about HR law, but they probably are also good with other kinds of people-related skills and the tools that go with it. And so it gives you a sense of a sort of a graph that goes across the labour market, and jobs get located at certain points along that graph, and they kind of have clusters of skills around it. What relatedness does is says, well, given an occupation, how likely is it going to be that it has these skills within it? And so it gives us just a prediction of, given where that job generally is, how likely this skill is to be found there. And so that can be quite useful to start thinking about if skills are missing, for example, that actually, because that could mean that even if it's not frequently mentioned now, it could be up and coming for the future. And so we have a worked example where we use the real comparative advantage to say where a skill is, and we look at relatedness to say, well, where we expect it to be. And so what we've done is we've plotted 4 occupations, quite different ones: actuaries, economists and statisticians, programmers, business research and administrative professionals, and elsewhere classified, which includes a lot of business research and business analyst type roles, and then IT engineers as well. So all of them are concentrated for this skill in question, Python, but we plotted it for 2017 and 2021, so you can see the change over time. And so you can see that all of them have increased actually in their use of Python relative to the wider labour market. But the one that's increased the least was actually programmers, because it started from a high base. It's extremely related. You can see it's at the top right there. And so it's actually not changed that much because they were already deep into Python. Whereas these other 3 occupations have seen other kinds of change. So you can see with IT engineers that it's not particularly related, but it is going up quite a lot. And so you can see that maybe that's being used as a marker by employers as to whether you've got the kinds of skills that are necessary for it. The actuaries, economists and statisticians, a world that is kind of closer to my career background, there you can see that it's become more related. As I say, the sort of the expectation around this technology is becoming more front and center. Economists are expected to know more about data, same with statisticians. The sort of the divide between data science and stats is kind of weakening. And at the same time, it has become more frequent. So that's kind of the classic pattern that you'd expect to see. Something becomes more related and it becomes more concentrated. And a really interesting one to finish off is this business research and administrative professionals, where it's actually become more related, but it hasn't yet become a lot more frequently found. And so if I was looking at this from a workforce planning perspective, I'd be thinking, if I can find people for those kind of roles that have more advanced skills around Python or are interested in developing them, that might be preparing me for the future. And so it's quite sort of an interesting contrast in that sense.
Yeah, interesting. And do we see things going the other way? You picked out some interesting examples. Are there examples where things are heading south on those categories?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't got an example here, but it's certainly, you know, in terms of that story about declining ubiquity that we were talking about before, then that's kind of the pattern you'd expect to see, that it would fall in relatedness and then start to fall out of use, because actually the pattern starts to break down. So if a technology, for example, became less relevant, then it would start to become less predictable how it's connected to other skills. It would then become less related to, start to see probably decline left-right first, you know, so if it starts to move leftward, and then you start to see the real comparative advantage falling, depending on how rapidly the decline was relative to the wider labour market. But within its specialised spaces, yeah, you would expect to see that.
Gotcha.
And then, yeah, looking ahead, you know, these are kind of building blocks that allow us to get to sort of where we ultimately want to get to, which is to start thinking about how different skills together have an have an implication for what those skills mean. And so, in particular, what we want to do is, where we've got these skills that are quite widely found, like Python, for example, can we infer something from the mix of skills that go around that skill about how highly proficient you need to be in order to do that job. So, for example, if you've got a job ad that says that you need skills in Python and skills in management, well, you know, without any more information, that maybe doesn't mean a lot about how much kind of Python you actually need. And so we can link that salary data to also explore the question. Whereas at the other end, if you've got Python and skills and algorithms being demanded, well, that's probably somebody who's being expected to do quite advanced work, because you're expected to design an algorithm and then implement it. And so, you know, if we can begin to get a sense of what those combinations together mean, it kind of multiplies our insight into the sort of the depth of skills needed. And then on this second point there, if we can then start to pull that information together, we can maybe arrive at some summary metrics to say, rather than just having programmers, we can start to say this is a high skill programmer and this is a more generic low skill programmer, and the same in lots of different occupations. So, you know, a financial analyst, yeah, as we know, a lot of these job titles, especially at the occupation level, as you said earlier, they can be quite broad, but they can often be quite misleading anyway, even if you've got a bit more granularity, because what's the expectation here? Are you hiring for a more junior role or a more generic role, or have you got something that's really specific in mind? And the more that we can add that kind of layer of insight there, the more that we can start to say, you know, you can imagine looking at different geographies here, so you can compare kind of technology roles in central London with Leeds and say, you know, what's this sort of the typical expected level of proficiency involved? And so, yeah, just starting to get to these kind of, you know, aggregate measures that allow us to start to say, well, what are these jobs really saying with their skills information, and where does that take us in terms of what kind of responses that we, as recruiters or education providers or as local communities, need to do to respond to that.
Cool. No, interesting. And by the way, I've been consulting my pocket dictionary, and photonics is the branch of technology concerned with the properties and transmission of photons, for example, in fiber optics. So there you go.
That's true. And I did a project with the Physics Society, the Institute of Physics, sorry, last year. So I did vaguely know that, but I don't really know what that involves. So it's kind of like, it's sort of a know that as opposed to sort of know how thing. So
I just read the words.
Right.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Well, I wonder if we can pause here, Duncan, and just reflect a little bit, because there's a lot of information. I'm sure that's it's probably quite complex. It's certainly yeah, interesting and some good dimensions there, and no doubt folks will maybe want to reflect on this and unpick it a little more. But I just wonder if we could just sort of summarize a little bit by bringing it back to kind of what does this mean in the real world? How might we use this? So thinking from the perspective of educators, of course, as we see emergent skills that are broadly more broadly applicable, then we can make sure that education more generally is aligned to, of course, laying in those foundational skills, those broad skills that are going to have impact out in various places, but also start to really hone specific technical education, right, in terms of really picking out those skills that are going to have the biggest impact from a labor market perspective. Any other kind of quick thoughts from an education standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's about understanding the sort of the skills that kind of have the greatest kind of transferable value. I think that's kind of important. The ubiquity thing starts to come in there. So are you training somebody in things that are going to be kind of useful for lots of roles? Because certainly, like, you know, that is a value of education, that you're not just for a very specific role, but you have the ability to sort of move it around. Also understanding what the things that are going to be important sort of moving ahead. So that's where the relatedness analysis comes in as well. And then beginning to get to grips with what are the combinations of skills. So like the point on the left on the screen there, that really sort of together make the difference. And so, you know, if the sort of the highest end demands are about kind of Python and algorithms, as in that example, then that gives you a clue as to what kind of direction you want to take these sort of skills developments in. So it just gives you a lot more depth of insight, rather than just a tick list of you need to be covering these skills. You can start to think about why you should be covering them and where you should be taking them as well.
Cool, interesting. And so then moving on to the regional economic planning dimension, so whether that be around investing in the economic infrastructure of regions or business attraction and development that way. Obviously, skills and the education system has a big role to play. So all of what you just described there applies as much in the regional setting, but also obviously a big part of, and we've seen our data being used in that setting, is really helping localities and regions articulate various strengths and limitations and holes in labor markets. And traditionally that's been done at more of an industry level. What industries do we have present that make us stand out and different, and which ones don't seem to be in our locality, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And we've historically talked about, actually, you know, that's a proxy for actually the talent, the capabilities within the workforce that is more attractive, and particularly as the economy evolves ever such, it's really that occupational layer. But it seems to me that what you're describing here starts to help us really start to get to a very granular level, at a regional level, of what the unique selling points might be at a skill or skills clustering level. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And start to think about what kind of your talent supply could be transferable to. And there's additional things that we've got coming down the pipeline as a company about thinking about the jumps that you have to make to move from one job to another, which can also help with that too. So yeah, and I think kind of getting to grips with, you know, businesses that you're trying to attract to your region, and helping to think through, well, how can you kind of adapt your workforce to what they require, is all important work to be able to do as a sort of a local area and a regional community.
Yeah, and presumably some degree of resilience or adaptability to labour market change as well, and the changing environment we're in. Yeah, fascinating. And then from a workforce planning and employer perspective, perhaps a recruiter perspective, to some extent, maybe it just strikes me the ability to really start to define roles more specifically about what's most critical and important, as opposed to throwing out a massive wish list of all the things that we're looking for. And also then, you know, maybe thinking about which skills are foundational must-haves versus skills that are a wish list would love to have, that maybe we could nurture and develop within the workforce, as opposed to have to always go out to the new work to source new talent.
I think so. Yeah, and I think as well that there's an additional angle on this, which is that, you know, thinking about the adjacencies that you've got in terms of recruitment pools. So you can actually start to say, well, actually, you know, this is the mix of skills. It's the opposite of what local communities do in many ways, and stuff. In terms of selling what they've got, it's kind of as a workforce planner, you can think about alternative ways of meeting your workforce needs in terms of potential talent pools, especially if you're on the sort of staffing and recruitment side. The same applies. But I think that that's all important, and I think the sort of the relatedness point is also valuable from their perspective. If you spot skills that are highly related but not particularly frequently cited, that gives you a sense of where things are going, and you know, that can also be a valuable thing to start thinking about, you know, where your labour market is moving.
That's a really good point. I think aligns to one of the questions that's been raised, so I might just quickly segue into that theme, which is you know, the sources of data that are helping us to derive and understand what skills are being sought in the labour market or appear in the labour market is heavily weighted towards employer job postings, where there's a rich source of information that's being communicated, and the sorts of scale of data sets and sample sizes that we've got mean that we can get a good breadth of coverage. As you know, dealing with just the odd posting here or there, you'll never quite get the full view. That thousands of postings for similar roles will give you a better, more holistic view, right? But on the profile side, so kind of we're trying to get a sense of what skills are available within the workforce. Again, another sample size, but it's perhaps because it is so much more self-reported, open to perhaps a lot of variation, but also under-reporting of certain things. So your point about the relatedness is a really interesting one, about potentially, if we can see from the large sample size on the demand side, we can infer what the likely relatedness of certain skills are. It could be that if we're not seeing those skills being actively mentioned within a candidate pool, we might be able to infer that if they're mentioning certain skills, then other skills would typically come along with them. And so, of course, at interview stage, or when you're actually connecting with individuals, you can tease that out and work out whether they do or not. But at least we're shooting in the right direction in that sense.
Absolutely. I mean, it's possible to envisage a future where you get a sense across the wide range of skills. I think to that question's point, I think the whole point of the stuff that's on the screen there is to avoid getting into the quagmire of people claiming that they're kind of have advanced Excel skills, and actually look at the pattern of skills that they've got to say if they've got Excel and they've also worked in kind of an investment analyst role, say, then they've probably got an advanced Excel skill. If they say they've got Excel and they've been writing novels for the past 30 years, and good though that job is, I'm sure, we can't really say that much for their Excel skill, and therefore there's nothing to that. So that's the whole point, really, that we know that those biases can exist, and so we can kind of hopefully see past them a bit by looking at the pattern of skills. And as you say, the pattern works the other way, which is, can you then sort of say, well, actually on the whole these skills are fairly similar to each other, and therefore you might want this one, but they've got these other skills, and so you can start to look at the sort of the similarity of things and start to explore, well, how near are they actually, even if they haven't got the specific point that you've been looking for.
And I also think a really important point on this is that we're looking for clues in the data to help us narrow our focus, not necessarily to answer all the questions, right? At the end of the day, your Excel loving author could be the world's leading genius in Excel, but you give it a sample of a few hundred of those, it's probably the one in a few hundred as opposed to every one of them. And there are other ways to find that out, right? Through testing and through accreditations and qualifications and all sorts like that. So this is really about, I suppose, the first layer of continuing to let the data do the hard work of sifting, so that you can get down to the bits that quite frankly us humans will always have to do, because that's what makes us relevant in the labor market these days, is our humanity, right? So yes. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Duncan, for sharing the work that you and your team are doing, and sharing your incredible experience and knowledge and capabilities with us. And I hope that's been helpful to folks as we've pondered these questions. I do want to point you towards some resources. First and foremost, the Lightcast skills library that you mentioned. You can find that at skills.lightcast.io. Whole wealth of resources and tools to play with, so you can dive into the library. It's an open access taxonomy. You can access the API, you can explore that data, and a number of tools there. And we should say, the work that you're doing is early stages. We've got some projects coming through that are driving some of that work. But our goal with any of this kind of stuff is not just to show off how clever you and your team are necessarily, although it's obviously very nice to do so, but actually we're thinking about these things because we see this as the next level of what we can bring to our data, but also to our tools to make this insight more useful. So we're still, this is a very early peak, but the hope is, and the goal here is that as we start to refine those techniques, we can start to deliver them to you on scale through the library, through our tools and services that leverage that library. So feel free to check that out. I should add, if you are particularly fascinated by all of this, feel free to write the word skills into the question box, and we will come back to you. If you're an existing Lightcast customer, then we'll have your account manager come back to you, and would love to talk a bit more about how we might be able to help bring some of this knowledge to your work. If you're not, then one of our experts would happily reach out to you and talk some more about some of this, but you have the resources as well on the screen there. I also want to point you towards another resource that we've recently made available, which is actually a tool that helps you to start to explore some of the European data that we've got built and are continuing to build out. So it's a little tool called European Insights that allows you to just look at a few of the key European countries you've got data for. It's not all of them, it's just a little taster and a dive into some of the top occupations in demand in those countries, so that you can start to look across different geographies and unlock some deeper insights on median salaries, and pertinent to this, the sorts of skills that we're seeing being mentioned associated with those roles. And you can look across different countries, different roles, to see how things are evolving. So if you have a particular interest in understanding the wider European labour market, then I'd encourage you to check that free resource out. Go in and have a play. You can just fill your details in to unlock a bit more information as well there. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And while we're on the topic of resources, I just want to point you towards a couple of upcoming webinars we've got coming down the line. So into December, 12th of December, Richard from our team, who's leading our work in the UK higher education space, is combining with one of our good friends, Professor Rupert Ward at University of Huddersfield, a big focus in his work, academic work, on skills data. And they will be sharing with you some work that Huddersfield and others have been doing to start to think about how education can better align with the realities that we've just been talking about the granularity of skills and the role that micro-credentialing might play in helping to really bring a sense of assessment to those more granular skill components there. So that will be a very interesting session coming up, and I know Rupert's done a lot of fantastic work, published work on the topic, so I'm excited to hear what he's going to be sharing. And then Duncan and I, we return a few days later after that one on the 15th to our roundup of the year of the UK labour market. So we're going to focus in on the UK labour market. We're going to look back and see what we can learn from what's happened in the labour market through the year, and start to maybe cast our gaze towards what next year might bring. Who knows? A lot of crazy, a lot of opportunity though, and new possibilities. And as I say, we're here to come alongside you to help you work through the changes and the variations that are happening and really unlock those possibilities. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to say a massive thank you to Duncan. Thank you so much for sharing your work and joining us today.
No problem. Good to be here, as always.
I'm very glad to hear that. And I think we're really just about running out of time. So I tell you what, Debbie, just going to throw back to you. Are there any kind of major burning questions that you've picked up that we might be able to quickly answer? If not, we obviously can come back to you separately after the session. So back to you, Debbie.
Okay, because there's a few questions that we need to come to, but as you say, probably follow up with them afterwards. But there's one which says where we're talking about common skills in a particular geographic area, management quite often appears in the top 10 common skills. Does management mean, is it managing supervisors, others, or simply self-management, or both? So it's just a quick generic one to Duncan.
Yeah. That's a good jumping off point to kind of talk about the things that we were alluding to at the end there. So all that we can tag are what employers say in job ads. So the ambiguities are kind of inherent because it's how they, management is used in lots of different ways, as that question implies. And so what we want to do is try and look at the connection to other skills to try and get some inference on what they actually mean by that. Is it just saying management in that kind of management of self way, or is it, if it's connected to other things, can we start to infer more about what that actually means? So yeah, that's kind of why we're doing the work.
Okay, cool. And just another one, is it possible to do this type of analysis across emerging technology sectors, for example, quantum, semiconductors, AI, etc., Duncan?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. I mean, certainly anywhere where our skills are, and any way we can kind of divide up the labour market as a sort of a frame to do that. So yes, in principle, anywhere. And I think actually the more emergent technology areas are probably where it starts to have the most kind of insight, because you actually see the rapid changes and the emergence of skills and so on. So yeah, definitely.
Oh,
and this
great.
Is where, if I can just jump in, this is where we really rely on bringing our expertise on the data and the understanding of the data to customers like yourselves who maybe have a particular focus, and we can kind of combine your knowledge of that. So Duncan, you mentioned the Institute of Physics work where we were able to bring our data to a specific set of questions associated. So I'd encourage you, if that's a particular field of interest, then feel free to reach out. We'd love to see if we can't combine our expertise there. But I'd encourage you to go into the Lightcast skills library, the link I mentioned, and it will be circulated, and start to search for a few of those specific terms. And one question for emergent technologies and markets is, are they emergent enough to have appeared? And if not, we start looking for them in the library so you can make those recommendations. But if they are in there, then certainly that's something we can be tracking. So yeah, lots of possibilities there.
Cool, that's great. Are these metrics found in Analyst?
Not yet. No, I think we're in R&D here, and we will be bringing them some sort of research projects with customers in the next sort of 6 months, year. And then if that all goes well, and then at some point we would love to be able to bring the right things to Analyst.
Fab. Thank you so much, guys. That was a great webinar.
Thank you.
So if there's no more questions, thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Andy and Duncan, and we'll see you next month.
Pleasure. Cheers. Take care.